I'm not quite sure how these were selected, but this is what was recorded in the final edition of High Life, June the 5th, 1969, so it must have been a fact. We graduated from Fairmont Senior High as the 89th group of students from this institution and the 40th group of seniors to walk across the stage at the present building at Loop Park. There were over 300 students in our group, making us one of the largest classes ever to graduate in the history of the school. High school wasn't perfect for all of us back then, but we made the best of it. Our high school years went quickly, especially the senior year. How many of us remember what we did on senior week? Just a little over 20 years ago. We had a senior assembly, a senior picnic, a senior sermon, we needed it, a senior swimming party, a senior banquet and dance at the college, and finally commencement itself. Commencement is a good term because everything else in our lives up to this date commenced right after we walked across that stage. I'll save the reminiscing for the rest of the program. But before I do that, I'd like to say to Ned, thank you for telling me to go right ahead, because this has been one of the most memorable, rewarding, and fulfilling experiences of my life. I feel honored to have been a part of it. I feel fortunate and proud to have been a part of the class of '69. We were a unique class.
Of the Fairmont Senior High School class of 1969 begins in the early 1950s when most of us were born. Looking back today, we were fortunate to have the solid foundation of growing up in the 50s, the social compassion of coming of age in the 60s, the free spirits of being young adults in the 70s, combined with the responsible citizenship of the 80s. So what does that make us today? Baby boomers looking forward to middle age, perhaps? To paraphrase Dickens and Shakespeare, high school was the best of times or the worst of times. Perhaps a winter of discontent or a summer for growing up. It hardly seems possible that we graduated some 20 years ago. Let's look at our class during the formative years. Nourished on Wonder Bread and Ovaltine, these are some of the eager faces that were found at schools in and around Fairmont in 1957 and 1958. We were students at Barnes, Butcher, J.N., Miller, St. Peter's, White, Watson, and Whitehall schools. During our first year of school, an Earth satellite called Sputnik was shot into outer space by the Russians. This was only one of several significant events that would mark our lives and perhaps make the class of '69 unique. With the advent of Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education in 1954, schools across America began to desegregate by the late 50s. In Fairmont, we entered first grade as the second group of students who would complete all 12 years in non-segregated schools, an achievement to be proud of in the conservative 50s. President Eisenhower was remembered more for his campaign slogan, "I like Ike," than any significant act to our group. We had Elvis rockin' and rollin' until he went to the Army for a year. By second grade, Alaska and Hawaii became the 49th and 50th states respectively, and the flags of our classroom changed to accommodate the addition of 2 new stars. We all remember the flags because we did say the Pledge of Allegiance and a prayer to begin the day. By the 1960s, some of us were lucky to have color televisions to watch Bonanza and Walt Disney in wondrous but fuzzy hues. By third grade, we were more aware of American politics and the election of John F. Kennedy, who, in 3 short years after his inauguration in 1960, was killed on a Friday in November 1963. Most of us can remember the classroom we were in when the news was announced or shared by our 7th grade teacher. Most of us find ourselves recalling this particular time on the anniversary of the event that saddened America. The period of time after President Kennedy shaped our lives as well. We were aware of civil rights movements in the South. At home, maybe unnoticed, we were the beneficiaries of many War on Poverty programs ushered in with LBJ's Great Society.
Our junior high years introduced us to the Beatles, the Dave Clark Five, the Rolling Stones, and many other rock and roll groups who would remain part of our musical scene throughout high school and later years. We spent this time at Fairmont Junior High, Barnes Junior High, or Miller Junior High. By 1965, most of us came together for the 9th grade at West Fairmont. We were the 3rd group of freshmen to attend classes in the new building on the Fairmont Senior High campus. As freshmen, most of our classes were assigned to this building, and we were most definitely underclass men and women. Most of us had Miss Rice for English, wherein it took a period of several weeks to plow through great expectations. Mr. Phelps taught civics, Miss Huber and a host of others taught varying levels of math. The diminutive Miss Frankman, who later became Mrs. Appletranger, taught us science and entertained us with stories about UFOs. Were you a member of the UFO Club back in 1965? As freshmen, we tried our best to fit in, but you know how it was. We received no respect. We stood up in the back of the auditorium at assemblies since there wasn't room to be seated. We were, well, you know, not really important. Our class pictures, shot quickly with a total lack of finesse by a photographer who was in a great rush to get out of there, resulted in frozen images of nerdy-looking 9th graders who were definitely uncool. It didn't matter what they really looked like, for the freshman section of the yearbook was mostly minuscule. Here's what we looked like back then. Being a freshman meant that you were part of student activities such as football. Breaking a tradition of winning repeatedly and dominating our crosstown rivals, we lost to the East Fairmont Bees that year in the annual Veterans Day game. We lost the game big time. By the sophomore year, our home rooms were in the ground floor of the main building. Lower junior high students joined us, and being a sophomore did have its advantages, like being old enough to get a driver's license and the fact that at least you weren't a freshman any longer. We could now be seated in the balcony of the auditorium during assemblies, where we were heard to yell such well-conceived gems as "sophomores have soul," with 2 short claps of the hands. Several teachers provided the basics of grammar and Julius Caesar, including Mrs. Brown, who always seemed to be adjusting some errant strap under her sweater.
For the study of our first truly exotic high school subject, biology, our group was divided between Miss Stewart and Miss Bennett. Yet neither teacher ever got around to any really interesting details of human sexuality, and we soon came to realize that neither teacher ever even considered providing the anatomically correct pictures of the male and female reproductive organs for which each of us at one time or another searched through the textbook. How many of you remember the section of the biology text on evolution? It had been blacked out for sale to school boards in the South, and that made it all the more intriguing to try to read the print through the covering layer of black ink. For quite a number of us, that was probably the only portion of the biology book we studied diligently. And speaking of diligence, sophomore year marked the first time we were afforded the opportunity to take advanced math classes whose names had sounded so stratospheric when we first heard of them during junior high. Subjects like plane geometry and algebra whatchamacallit. So we wouldn't be influenced to take stratospheric drug-induced mind trips. We were shown great propaganda movies like LSD, Insight or Insanity, lest we fall into the pathway of becoming future hippies, destined to join some psychedelic love-in and never be home in time to make curfew. The sophomores were enrolled in physical education in the name of the President's Council on Physical Fitness, no doubt so we would not be outdone by the Russians at the Olympics. The sexes, or should I say genders, were safely partitioned from each other thanks to a large folding door that split the gym in two, except for a brief time during lunch. Surely they had decided to allow no more than an occasional glimpse of the other gender's gym uniforms in order to avoid the risk of stimulating anyone's prurient interest. Wasn't there something absolutely exciting about the bloomer outfits worn by the girls? Not to mention the boys' white muscle shirts. We'll be taking a survey later of how many of you women remember swearing to Mrs. Goodwin it was your turn to wash regular instead of showering during those special days of the month, even if you weren't really, having those days. Boys had to take showers regardless, unless you had a special excuse signed by 3 pediatricians and a specialist in knee-high cases of athlete's foot. Speaking of athlete's foot, keeping up the tradition we had established a year earlier, we lost again, miserably, to the East Fairmont Bees in the annual Veterans Day game for the city football championship. The next year, suddenly more social status was awarded to us, not to mention a home room located on the main floor. Juniors got other honors, such as hosting a carnival in the fall to raise money for the prom the following spring. We had The Wizard of Oz as our theme that year. It was 1967 to 68, and the Beatles were still among the most popular groups. Simon and Garfunkel were just emerging from obscurity. Women's liberation was suddenly more than a phrase, as it proved to be a genuine movement. Television sets were bringing live pictures of a strange, imponderable conflict that involved larger and larger numbers of American boys, mostly our age. We watched them embroiled in a war set in jungles somewhere in Southeast Asia. What we had once called French Indochina when this struggle began while we were in elementary school was now a divided country at war. It was clear that our troops were battling against the creeping menace of communism, or at least we were told that was perfectly clear. But back then, most of us couldn't even find Vietnam on the map, and maybe in 1968, we weren't even aware of the growing conflict it was generating at home, or the protests being launched by a new generation of student activists, commonly branded as radicals. LBJ refused to run for president in '68. This and the assassination of Bobby Kennedy left Richard Nixon well on his way to being swept into office on the strength of promises to have the boys home by Christmas.
Perhaps the only form of student protest we carried out was the famous walkout over a school board's failure in 1968. The event grew out of a discussion in Mrs. Van Meter's morning speech class. Suddenly, like the student activist we'd heard so much about around the country, a school-wide walkout was planned for 1 p.m. that afternoon. Somehow the message circulated like wildfire, and every student got the message to leave the building. And they did. While nearly every student stayed outside the building prior to the 1 o'clock class period, 98% of them unceremoniously marched right back in after Mr. Malcolm, Mr. Julian, and Mr. Charlton warned of dire punishment for those who just didn't get their butts back inside the building pronto. By 1:05 p.m., only a handful of students bravely remained outside. And then about half of them split for the day, leaving a very nervous group of approximately 20 radicals to carry on from there. Not having a lot of protest organizing experience, the small group boldly walked to the courthouse, where they got their pictures taken and wondered what kind of hell there would be to pay once their parents found out about it. The next day's Fairmont Time read something like, "Hundreds of militant students riot at Fairmont West," or something like that. Instead of thanking the students for making a statement to the community about our disappointment over a school bond failure, the group of protesters who were dumb enough to go back to school by 2 p.m. had to listen to Mr. Charlton's tirade about the embarrassment of it all. There's a first time for everything. Oh well, junior year, at least we got better seats in the auditorium to the right and left of the center section on the main floor. Our junior year teachers included Mrs. Savarino for history, Linda Morgan for English, Miss Oliverio and Mrs. Smith for typing, Mr. Reppert for something, Mrs. Christian for music, Mr. Wood for band, and the exotic exchange teacher from France, Mademoiselle Thérèse Marseille. Mademoiselle Marseille had her culture broadened when she returned to her homeroom only to find a confusing phrase scrawled across the blackboard. "What does this mean, the gold shucks?" she demanded to know from each and every student.
"1968 was the memorable year the Thespians produced West Side Story. Mr. Malcolm had personally made this selection because the year before, East Fairmont had staged My Fair Lady, and he wasn't to be outdone by the rival school. However, the production was subject of much censoring once school officials realized that the musical dealt with Puerto Rican and urban gang war in the slums of New York City. Mrs. Goodwin's choreography mostly resembled cheerleading formations, but all in all, it was a memorable production despite all the cutting and censorship. Oh yes, we lost the East-West football game again that year. Would it ever end, we wondered? East Fairmont had never dominated the annual football series from the beginning of time. Senior year at last. Great seats in the auditorium. We were now in the center aisles. What more could you ask for? We even had photograph IDs taken, but it's highly unlikely they were ever used by any student. Our senior photographs were taken by Buffington Studios in August 1968. Without extra charge, Mr. Buffington colored in our pictures and touched up our hair. Hey, that's the way it was back then. No true-to-life color action photos for the yearbook. The senior girls had a choice of 3 circle pins from the collection of Casey Dollison to wear after they turned their sweaters backwards on just for the photo. The circle pin meant virginity or something like that. About 20 new faces joined our senior class that year as St. Peter's High School or Fairmont Catholic High School phased out the upper-level grades. Fish sticks became a regular Friday feature in the cafeteria. As seniors, we had homerooms on the top floor and, of course, first dibs on hanging around Lincoln's statue. Mr. Strait taught us American history and had a unique way of tearing up strips of newsprint upon which you wrote answers to his surprise pop quizzes. Mrs. Eddy was the perennial secretary with neatly coiffed hair and bird-like legs. Mr. Mays taught business classes, Mr. White printing, Mrs. McLean art, Miss Oliverio and Mrs. Smith typing, Mr. Wood, band, Mrs. Christian, music, Mr. Modi, shop, Mr. Brookover, chemistry and physics, Mr. Pence, history, and Mr. Blount, technical drawing. Mrs. Talkington and Mrs. Trissler taught English. Mrs. Belton also taught senior English with such creativity and zest, rarely wasting a minute in her classes. At the beginning of each period, she played her famous vocabulary records. A voice would state a word and use it in a sentence. Some examples are unctuous, oily, overly suave. The man was unctuous. Or here's another one, bombastic, swollen, turgid. The river was bombastic. She was very modern in her thinking as she allowed us to read bestsellers for our book reports.
We also had elected queens for various events, an assortment of student leaders, and a large group of athletes in many sports. The latter were just boys because equal opportunity for female athletes was yet to be thought about or implemented at the high school level. Oh yes, speaking of sports, while we didn't actually lose the East-West football game, the best we could do was end in a 13-13 tie in the usual post-game fight on the field. Obviously, our battered bee mascot was hardly a symbol of what we hoped would happen on the gridiron in 1968. Thus, we became the first group of students who spent their entire West Fairmont High School years without a football victory over the East Fairmont Bees. Prior to the East-West game, Jerry Davison entered the stadium with a torch he ceremoniously tossed into a gigantic Olympic torch. It was fashioned from chicken wire and tin foil as a labor of love by the Key Club. Luckily, the city's fire department was on hand to control the fire, as the whole contraption burned up before our eyes. It was a good fall, but local and national events continued to impact our lives. As the boys turned 18, a trip to the local draft board was required for registration. Once you were given that selective service card, the future looked less than rosy as the American troops continued to swell in Vietnam. We would later learn that more Americans were killed in those Asian jungles than in our country's most noted struggle, the Civil War, as the U.S. began a very long retreat from Vietnam in '69. In November 1968, an explosion at a coal mine near Farmington would also have an impact on our lives, as 78 miners were killed. This event brought national television into Marion County, and the country was focused on a 10-day vigil by the smoking portals until the decision to close the mine was made. This was the first major tragedy we could identify that affected students and faculty directly. After all, Vietnam was still half the world away. The world was changing, and so were we, along with it. By the first half of the senior year, we made plans for the rest of our lives. A future in college, in the military, in the workforce, or marriage. We were becoming adults, whether we were ready or not.
Let's look at fashion and fads that shaped our lives. At some point in time, we must have had a Daniel Boone hat if we were boys, or a wig hat if we were girls. We had or used at one point or another a hula hoop or a Schwinn bike. Maybe you had a pair of Detroit roller skates used faithfully at the 12th Street or Bellevue roller rinks on Fridays, Saturdays, or Sundays. We went to movies at the Fairmont, Lee, or Eastland theaters. It was the era of Dr. Zhivago, Bonnie and Clyde, Romeo and Juliet, and 2001, A Space Odyssey. On TV in the afternoons, we watched Paul Shannon's Adventure Time. Other nights, we watched Mission Impossible, and Saturdays, American Bandstand and other programs. We donned Ben Casey shirts. While the hem length for girls was generally on the rise through the latter part of the 60s, if they were too short, a girl risked being sent home to change. Culottes were never allowed, though no one could ever give a valid reason as to why they were so bad. The only teachers who could wear pants were the men, but also assumed styled haircuts were big for the girls. One side was cut shorter than the other. For boys, sideburns, mustaches, and other socially frowned upon facial hair was taboo. However, by our senior year, most boys had Beatle-style bangs. The dress code did not address hairy legs for girls. The times they were a-changin', though, as something other than cigarettes was occasionally smoked on nicotine knob behind the school. We had many assemblies, many dances, many events that seemed to be an important part of our lives. We chronicled the events through our newspaper, The High Life, a bi-weekly publication. Our yearbook, Maple Leaves, served as a pictorial guide to most of the year. Remember our literary magazine, Scratches? While these creative endeavors were enthusiastically prepared by budding student journalists, all copy was subject to editorial review and approval by E.W. himself. Not everything made it into final publication. Here are a few of the pages that were censored.
We ended our senior year with a prom at the Armory, a senior picnic at Morris Park, and graduation in the school's auditorium. The girls were in white gowns, the boys in blue. About 310 students marched across the stage to receive our diplomas and plan what came next. Most of us weren't really sure, but we marched in time to pomp and circumstance and tried to act as if we had everything in total control. Did we realize in the next few weeks of that summer of '69, an American would land on the moon and our country would reach a technological zenith? Did we make plans to attend that great love-in at Yasgur's farm called Woodstock? Did we get ready to enter the 1970s era of free love, free spirit, free expression? Were we truly living in the age of Aquarius, where one could find harmony and understanding, sympathy and love abounding, no more falsehoods or derision, only inner feeling visions in the mind's true liberation? Aquarius? One thing, though, we had lots of avenues for free expression by 1969, and appropriately, expressions was the theme in our yearbook. In it, we chronicled the many expressions of our senior year itself, through the campus, the students, the teachers, the activities, and the myriad events that seemed to be the most important part of our lives at that point in time. Maybe today it all seems so long ago, so far removed, a trifle mundane, and perhaps not very important at all. Why bother about it anyway, some might ask? Well, a reunion is best described as a gathering of persons who have been separated. 20 years is a long time. The class of 1969 collected their diplomas and embarked on a new venture entitled Bigger and Better Things. But sometimes it's good to look back, reminisce, and indulge into an overview of past experiences that helped shape our lives, whether we want to admit it or not. Perhaps the 1969 yearbook says it all, with these closing words. As the school year comes to an end, we find ourselves remembering not only the happy times, but the sad times as well. We are sorry that the classes are over and the people are gone. But we are exuberant because next year will bring new people with new expressions. A year laced with dances, plays, and athletics. A year bound in success and defeat. A year intertwined with learning and working. A year wrapped in friendship and sorrow. A year reflected in hope, achievement, enthusiasm, and adjustment. A year remembered by the expressions of '69.
Okay, all man, that's great. Okay? Also, after the rest stood up, we need to have 10 people on the side. We'll move the steps. I'm going to be up on the ladder shooting down, so I'll be able to see your face. So once we get everybody up, we need 10 people on that side, 10 people on this side. Okay? Okay? And what we're going to have to do, is try to find some shorter people and see if we can get them stood up on the back chairs without hitting your head on the seat. So we get somebody.
I'm taking off to be one lady on the bar. Oh,
We can get a couple more guys on the side, and then we're going to try to stagger between each other, staying on the front there. So let's try to make room for a few more in the front there. First we need to get 10 deep right here on the side. And the last people in the back, they can walk up on the steps. Okay?
Lose these chairs. Lose these chairs. Lose these chairs. Put people on this row right behind us.